It is a careful, thoughtful, insightful interview on one of the topics of our time. Transgender cyclist Emily Bridges, recently barred from competing in the sport she loves and the category she believes she belongs in, tonight exclusively tells Steve Scott what it is like to be caught in the crossfire.
It is very difficult to read everything people are saying about you and know what people are saying about you. And it hurts.
Amongst other things, she describes the abuse she received after the Prime Minister said biological males should not be allowed to compete in female sporting events.
And the response after that was as expected. I had threats of physical violence made against me by complete strangers online.
Whatever your views, it's an interview you are unlikely to forget, and as Steve said, at the very least it adds nuance and insight to an often divisive subject. Also on News at 10 tonight. More travel chaos. Now we face 3 days of rail strikes across Britain. The Conservative Party moves on, but has the country? Professor Jane Green will tell us tonight what voters are thinking. And the modest man who helped change the face of football.
This is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. We begin tonight with an exclusive interview which provides a rare, compelling and sometimes emotional insight into one of the most complex topics of our time. In all the headline-grabbing debates surrounding transgender issues, we hardly ever hear in depth from someone whose gender puts them at the very heart of the matter. The transgender track cyclist Emily Bridges is one who has been, as it were, caught in the crossfire. Talking to Steve Scott, our sports editor, she described the heartbreak of suddenly being barred from competing in women's cycling despite following every rule and requirement whilst transitioning. She also said she had to endure threats and vilification after the Prime Minister's comments on the subject.
Emily Bridges is front and centre of global sport's most divisive issue, and especially recently, it has not been a good place to be.
It is very difficult to read everything people are saying about you and know what people are saying about you. And it hurts. It hurts.
For the past year, Bridges has adhered to British cycling's inclusion policy, reducing her testosterone to a level that allowed her to compete against women. In April, Bridges was due to race in an event against Dame Laura Kenny and other Olympians, but in the days before, cycling's world governing body, the UCI, said they would not sanction her eligibility, pending further assessments.
It was incredibly difficult because I knew that my main goal for the season, the Commonwealth Games, was then out of the question because I couldn't race this event, and it was unlikely I was going to be able to race any international events. So the Commonwealth Games are gone. It obviously came at very last minute, but I'd say that there's potentially a lot of public pressure to stop me racing.
To make matters worse for Bridges, British cycling then not so much as moved the goalposts, but uprooted them by suspending their policy completely. Effectively, she was now excluded from all women's racing.
They knew how that would impact on you, but they haven't made any contact.
No, I've had nothing from them. They said that they would be in touch about the procedure, about how they were going to make their new policy, but I haven't heard anything. So either they're not doing anything, or they're not doing what they said in their email to me, and including me in making a policy.
Has there been any stage at any time where you thought, I'm just going to race in men's races?
I can't do that. I can't race in men's anymore. It's not something that I'm prepared to put myself through again.
This weekend, Bridges rode in an independent event, but her last British cycling sanctioned race, as recently as March, was against men at the British Universities Championships.
And one of those races, you won?
Yes. What they haven't reported is that the day before, I come fourth in the individual pursuit, 12 seconds slower than I'd gone previously.
To mark Pride Month, Bridges became cover girl for Diva magazine. Inevitably, those who believe it will never be possible for her to compete fairly against women used it as an opportunity to lash out.
I am no faster compared to my fellow athletes than I was pre-transition.
Because you've been through male puberty, you have an inbuilt advantage and always will have that advantage. Do you accept that?
No, I don't. All of the research that has been done previously has not been done on athletes, it's been done on sedentary individuals. There's a number of papers that they cite and reviews that they cite, and a lot of the data that's in those papers just isn't relevant, especially to cycling. I'm part of research that's going on. We've observed the changes over a year of hormone therapy, and I feel, and the leaders of the study feel, that any advantage that I had pre-transition is gone.
In April, Boris Johnson catapulted trans inclusion in sport into the heart of mainstream politics.
I don't think that biological males should be competing in female sporting events.
Bridges says his intervention provoked a feeding frenzy online.
It's really strange to see probably the most famous man in Britain talking about you and having an opinion on something that he doesn't know anything about. And the response after that was as expected. I had threats of physical violence made against me by complete strangers online. And I'm scared a lot of the time about being who I am in public. People are entitled to hold an opinion about it. But there's a way to go about voicing that opinion, and threatening to kneecap me is not that way.
What would you say to those women who believe that you should never be allowed to compete against other women?
I empathise why you feel potentially threatened by my inclusion, why it might feel like the patriarchal structures that govern cycling and society in general, how you can feel it's another thing that's being pushed on you and it's another thing you've got to fight against. But those same structures, those same attitudes are the same things that pushed me down, pushed me into the closet, that I couldn't be myself. So I would ask if you can empathise with me, because I can empathise with you. I don't know if this will change anybody's mind, but that's the message I give to you.
And Steve is here to talk about all this. Steve, look, that was such a thoughtful interview on both sides. I mean, Emily herself talks about being part of scientific research. Where do you think this debate is going?
Well, look, we heard from Emily there about the study that she's undergoing under sports scientists at Loughborough University, and they are convinced that all the advantages she had pre-transition are gone. But then I can point you to many other scientists who will say that simply cannot be the case. And they point to the fact that they're adamant that research shows that if you go through male puberty, you retain an advantage. And this is the sort of unenviable dilemma facing sports governing bodies. Now, they're, of course, trying to make their sports as inclusive as possible. But at the same time, and especially at the elite level, they want competition to be fair. And they also want to protect the integrity of women's sport in general. But because of Emily Bridges, British cycling now is right at the centre of this, as you say, divisive issue. They said today they were determined that their sport would be inclusive and welcoming to all. And in a statement, they did apologise today for the uncertainty caused by the suspension of their past policy, particularly for the transgender and non-binary communities and women in their sport. And they said they would include all those communities when they're considering their next policy.
OK, Steve, thank you very much indeed. And you can hear Steve's full interview with Emily Bridges by going to our website, and I would urge you to do so. It is very well worth it. Now, we hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we are all going to have to brace ourselves for even more travel chaos later this month. Oh, great. 3 days of strikes are to be staged by thousands of rail workers across the country in what's been called by the RMT union the biggest outbreak of industrial action in the industry in a generation. The dates, June the 21st. 23rd and 25th. The row is about pay and job losses.
This will be the biggest strike on Britain's railways since the 1980s, bringing the network close to a standstill. 80% of services across the country will be either cancelled or severely disrupted. There will be picket lines outside stations, and 50,000 rail workers will walk out after negotiations broke down.
Our members need a pay rise. Many of them haven't had a pay rise for 2 to 3 years. We've got no agreement on job security, so we're facing compulsory redundancies, and we want a guarantee of no compulsory redundancies.
These strikes begin exactly 2 weeks today, for 3 days on the 21st of June, 23rd and the 25th. As well as network rail workers, 13 train operators are joining in with this industrial action. Even those operators not taking part in the strike, for example, ScotRail here at Glasgow Central Station, will still be affected because they rely on signallers and station managers, for example, who work for Network Rail. This will be huge disruption affecting every part of Britain's railway network. The Transport Secretary accuses the RMT union of jumping the gun, and the body that represents Britain's rail industry is urging striking workers to think again.
No one wins out of strikes, so it's really important we get back round the table and try and resolve this matter. Striking will only disadvantage customers, the economy and staff themselves.
Britain hasn't seen train strikes on such a scale for more than 3 decades. That was before the days of privatisation, when British Rail owned and operated almost the entire network. Now, about 5 million people make a train journey on any given day.
I travel a lot. I travel to Edinburgh for work, so yeah.
So you're going to be disrupted?
Yeah, I am.
It's not going to be great anyway, you know, won't be able to get to work.
It's all about fair pay. If I was in that position, I'll probably strike as well.
This strike will coincide with major events like Glastonbury, but the rail unions say they are doing it to fight for jobs, and so today's announcement is the customers' 2 weeks' notice to make other plans. Peter Smith, News at 10.
And there's yet more bad news tonight, and a warning of even worse to come about the steeply rising price of fuel. It was revealed today that average UK petrol prices have reached a record 175.6 pence a litre, up more than 6 pence in just a week. Diesel is also up, but experts are predicting things will get even grimmer, with people soon likely to face paying £2 a litre for petrol to fuel the vehicles they rely on. Now to the fallout from Boris Johnson's confidence vote victory. His ministers and supporters, and even some who voted against him, have been quick to endorse his message about drawing a line under Partygate and moving forward. But even this Prime Minister's determination to hail his limited victory as decisive can't entirely heal the wounds of division that easily. It must have stung, for instance, when his close ally during the pandemic, the UK's chief medical advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, called the Partygate rule-breaking disappointing.
How wounded is the Prime Minister?
Was the brief to stay cheerful? Be friendly?
How do you feel? He's a dead man walking, isn't he?
Just keep smiling. And then take a seat to listen to Boris Johnson, focusing on the Tory MPs who backed him in yesterday's confidence vote and not those who rebelled.
Thank you, by the way, everybody, for all your good work yesterday, because which was a very important day, because we're able now to draw a line under the issues that our opponents want to talk about.
But however much the Prime Minister and his top team want to change the record, criticism over Partygate hasn't gone away.
Well, I think it was really important at all stages that everyone stuck to the rules. There's no question about that. It only works when people stick to them, and it's very disappointing that that wasn't the case.
That from a man we watched every day through the pandemic, and then this on the impact of the confidence vote.
More than 40% decided really on their own to vote against him. And that's very difficult then to proceed as party leader in the long term. This is like trying to drive along the M1 with 2 flat tyres.
But as for the Tory rebels themselves, some of them most high profile were looking for any way to avoid making comment.
I'll try not to run you over. Thanks.
Or kept it fairly brief.
We move on, and I know the Prime Minister will want to focus on absolutely the priorities of this country.
So he's the right man to lead the party into the next election?
That's it, thanks.
There were warnings about the size of the rebellion, 148.
That's quite a significant number to come to that conclusion pretty much individually. And I think if we don't see some big changes from the Prime Minister in number 10, I can't see how that number wouldn't increase.
But more of those speaking out had this message.
We had a vote, we lost, we've got to accept it and move on, and the Prime Minister on that basis now is entitled to our support.
But he said colleagues were very worried about two critical by-elections coming up, one against Labour in the north of England and one against the Lib Dems in the southwest.
We'll campaign hard in those by-elections, we'll put our case, but it's not unusual in mid-term for governments to have challenging local elections, by-elections and so on.
Sounds like you're getting your excuses in.
Well, no, I mean, you're asking me about two elections that haven't taken place.
As for Sir Patrick Vallance calling Partygate very disappointing.
No, the Prime Minister accepts it was very disappointing. That's why the Prime Minister has repeatedly apologised to the British people.
Tonight, at a Falklands War commemoration with Princess Anne, the Prime Minister did seem a little more relaxed, joking about his troubles.
And I'm ashamed to say I think I'm the only one of the four speakers never to have been to the Falklands so far. Now things are a bit quieter in Westminster. Perhaps I may be able to go before too long, where things seem relatively peaceful.
Relatively peaceful, for now perhaps. But with that many Tory MPs voting against him, it may not be calm for long. Anushka Astana, News at 10.
Well, it is probably premature, to say the least, to claim the Prime Minister is politically a dead man walking, as some have done. But he may well be hoping his determination to draw a line and soldier on will go down well in Conservative heartlands at least. We visited Harrogate in North Yorkshire, a Tory stronghold in recent years, but whose MP voted against Boris Johnson.
Famous for its grand buildings and elegant streets, in the heart of Yorkshire, affluent Harrogate is a place Conservatives would normally expect to be well supported. At the Westminster Arcade, business owners are still annoyed about Partygate, but say worries about rising prices are more important.
I'm disgusted what's happened in Westminster, and I'm sure most of the country are. But unfortunately, we do have to move on because we can't linger anymore. The first thing they've got to address is the cost of living, because we all know what's coming for the next year to 2 years.
From tea rooms to tiaras, those views were echoed next door.
I think there's more pressing issues, not only in the UK, but also worldwide, that Boris needs to focus on.
So you don't want a new leader at this moment in time?
Not at this moment in time, no.
Would you vote Conservative?
Yes.
You would?
Yes, still.
The Conservatives have a 10,000 strong majority here. On the High Street, many had strong opinions on Boris Johnson.
We want leaders who we respect and admire, and I feel like dishonesty isn't conducive with either of those things. So I think he needs to do the decent thing and step down.
I'm happy to still PM. I'm sick of hearing about the parties and the mistake he made. Yeah, it's a big error. But I just want to move on.
Others feel politicians are totally out of step with the public. Some parents dropping kids off at this dance class were fed up.
It's nothing to be surprised about anymore because they're politicians, they tend not to tell the truth, and unfortunately nothing's going to change.
And he survived a vote of confidence.
He did surprisingly, yeah.
How do you feel about that?
Well, again, he got majority, didn't he, but only just.
And the Prime Minister's position may be secure for now, but there are big political challenges ahead, and the view from towns like Harrogate matters more than ever. Sarah Corker, News at 10.
Well, Professor Jane Green is one of the country's leading political scientists, and as many of you know, one of our key election analysts. Amongst other things, she spends a lot of time tracking how voters are thinking, and I'm pleased to say she joins us from Oxford tonight. Welcome, Jane. So let's dive straight into it. Boris Johnson likes to say this is a media obsession and voters don't care enough to worry about it, but what do you think?
Oh, it's extremely difficult for Boris Johnson. What you see with leader evaluations, so we often look at whether leaders are liked or disliked, and you tend to see leaders start out quite popular and their popularity declines over time. And that's kind of common. We don't love our political leaders in general, except obviously some people do, but on the whole we don't. But we tend to see that decline, and that's what's happened to Boris Johnson. So he's not unlike other leaders, but he didn't really have much of a honeymoon, and his ratings have declined. And of course what's happened is that, you know, this kind of terrible scandal that he's been wrapped up in has been really personal for people. So everybody's had an opinion about it. Everybody's formed an opinion about Boris Johnson. It's cut through to a tremendous degree, and he's not just disliked by many people, by the majority of people, but he's also not seen as credible, and he's also not seen as competent. And that is extremely difficult for any Prime Minister who's trying to now convince the country to get behind him and to listen to what he has to say.
Now, I guess the key question for Tory MPs going forward is this situation recoverable, given everything you've just told us? I mean, Gordon Brown always used to say by-elections are like a referendum on the government, but a general election is a choice. And that is fundamentally true, isn't it? And do we think about a general election in a different way, or do you think it's just the damage is too great?
So it's one of these things, like, people have this view of Boris Johnson that he kind of has this magical ability to come back from things. And, you know, the kind of question then is like, well, does that mean that he's got something special? Does that mean that voters are looking at him as a different kind of political leader? And I think the evidence is that voters are looking at him like any political leader that they've lost faith in and they've lost confidence in. And so, you know, let's think about what would it take for Boris Johnson to really regain public trust? You know, what would it take to rebuild a reputational hit like the one that he's experienced? Just a couple of weeks ago, the Chancellor announced a massive spending announcement in the cost of living crisis in the context of energy bills. And we didn't see public opinion change at all in terms of the opinion polls in response to that announcement. And you kind of have to wonder if something that large and that, you know, momentous, that will impact everybody, if that doesn't shift the dial, then what would it take for the dial to shift in favour of Boris Johnson, in favour of the Conservatives under Boris Johnson's leadership? And like I said before, the decline in leadership ratings, it tends to be a trend. It's very difficult once you've lost public confidence and trust, and once you've lost that reputation, to then see an increase in support. So it would be really hard to see that, very unlikely to see that before another general election.
Jane, fascinating as ever. Thank you so much. And just to let you know that Robert and Anushka have a fascinating podcast about Boris Johnson's confidence vote and everything that flows from it. You can find their chat, well worth a listen, via our website on the What You Need to Know podcast. And do subscribe. It's a great series. Now, although Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky praised Boris Johnson's confidence vote victory today, it's becoming increasingly clear that the war in his country is getting harder. In eastern Ukraine, Russian forces tonight seem to be tightening their grip on their main target, the Donbass region. Rohit travelled to places around what President Zelensky called the ghost cities of the front line, witnessing efforts to rescue some of the last remaining civilians.
We're looking for Valentina, but she doesn't want to be found. She knows why we're here. Volunteers have come to convince her it's time to leave, and you can hear why. The shelling is constant, the front line inching closer. She agrees to go, but brings a memento. A single flower from her front garden. Through damaged and deserted streets, it is a lonely journey. But not for long. Because there are other people who were left behind in the village. Not many, but some just wouldn't leave. Some just couldn't leave until now. This is their first glimpse for weeks of the world beyond their front gate. But then comfort comes from the radio. The music is turned up a crescendo to drown out the artillery fire outside. I haven't heard music like this for so long, he says. It is the most soothing sound for everyone on this escape from Avdiivka.
Ну, у нас балкон снесло. В зале окон нету в зале. На кухне одного стекла нету. Только в спальне вот это окна целые.
Valentina still has her flower, but has new friends too, and together they've reached safety. This should feel like a new beginning, but instead it feels like an ending. It is the end of 311 years combined of life in that village, a village to which they may never return. Further along the front line, we're with another ambulance crew, crisscrossing the region. Their role is not to evacuate, but to save those who didn't leave. They've just reached a village because there's been another attack. Smoke still rising from homes. They forced their way into one of them and eventually find a man struggling and in need of help.
Yeah, we need to get him in the ambulance.
Gardening.
Yeah, gardening.
And then?
And then the shelling begins. So the missile straps to his garden and a bottle of shrapnel just strapped to his stomach. So it's, yeah.
Putin's intended route is now marked with craters and missiles. This strike was probably meant for a bridge nearby, but Russian intentions don't matter to those almost killed by it.
Прилетела, разгромила все и до свидания. А теперь надо как-то выбирать.
Here, the choice about whether to go has now been made for them. They're running out of places to turn, and they're running out of time. Rohit Khatri, News at 10, Donbass.
The news from Ukraine is distressing as ever. Well, let's move on to a very different subject now and some sport. And Emma Raducanu's miserable run since winning the US Open continued today. Playing in Nottingham as part of her Wimbledon warm-up, the 19-year-old British player had to retire injured whilst trailing in the first set of her match. Afterwards, she said she didn't know if she'd be fit for Wimbledon. Finally tonight, the story of a quiet and modest man who played a key role in bringing women's football back into the mainstream after it had been banned for half a century. Nowadays, of course, the women's professional game is big business and followed by big crowds. Sir Dennis Follows was posthumously honoured by his old university in Nottingham for what he did in 1971.
Football as we know it today from the competitive angle may be very greatly changed.
Throughout Sir Dennis Follows' life, football had only ever been a man's game. That was until he decided to do something about it.
Them's the Preston ladies football team, Milan.
But that change took a while.
Yes, they're a fine lot of girls, aren't they?
Despite women briefly being allowed to play during the First World War, when the war ended, the rules changed. Women were banned from playing on FA pitches in a game deemed unsuitable for females.
Here's Dick Watmore racing down touchline. Oh, foul!
Mr Follows, though, believed all women should be allowed to play. Already a treasurer of the FA in 1971, he wrote a letter calling for the ban to be lifted, something his daughter says she knew would work.
He was a strong believer in equality in all aspects of life.
How does it feel to know that your father is getting the recognition today?
Very proud.
Something these former lionesses also feel. Leanne played as a striker in the 1970s. Jill was a midfielder, both playing unofficially, never able to progress.
You've just got to move forward
and
sort of appreciate that they have that chance to play in big stadiums. What did you dream of? To be a professional footballer. But it wasn't possible then.
But now it is, with today's Lionesses leading a career women once thought they never could. Sangeeta Lal, News at 10, Nottingham.
That is sadly all we have time for. I will see you tomorrow. Good night. Thanks for watching.
If you